Really, like what had happened a few years ago was that all we had here was a brick house, and the story that was being told within the house did refer to enslaved people sometimes, but also was more inclined to refer to the slave owner, the slave master, the enslaver, Hugh Rogan, and his romantic involvement with his wife and the fact that they were separated for 20 years. Part of the intervention that we wanted to do was maybe make it more upfront and obvious to visitors that this was part of a plantation where there was enslaved people. We know that Hugh Rogan would have bought his first slave in around about the 1790s, and then the number of enslaved people associated with the plantation would have built up over time. Everything that we see around us and all the wealth that these people had were either made by or brought about by the work of enslaved people. The number of enslaved people that had associated with this plantation rose to around about 70 people by the time of the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1860. From outside we can see just what a substantial house this is. The house itself stood exactly like us here in America, and then it was taken down brick by brick. You can still see some of the wee bits of adhesive where individual numbers were placed on the brick, and then the brick was reassembled exactly as it had been in Tennessee. Whenever the house was being taken down, a few bricks were found with small handprints the size of a child's hands. We believe that these bricks were made in a brickyard close by where the clay was suitable for making bricks, and whenever the bricks were fired, some child had handled the brick too early and put their handprints onto the brick. Typically, these bricks would have been made by enslaved people. So we can see as we talk that more and more of the wealth of the house is a reflection of the work of enslaved people. Here we've created the outlines of 4 enslaved cabins that would have been associated with the house. We don't know exactly where they were in relation to the house, but we know from other records of plantations in the area that this was a very typical sort of arrangement. These cabins are about 16 foot by 12 foot, and that would be very typical of enslaved cabins at that point in time. Quite often they were made out of logs because that was the cheapest building material that they had. They were generally one-room cabins like we have here with a door and just a single living space. Often they were in a row. As you can see when I'm standing here, it's not a huge space. There could have been around about 6, sometimes more, sometimes less people living in here. We have outlines of 4 cabins here. You see behind us here a garden associated with one of the enslaved cabins. We know from the work done at Monticello, which was the home of Thomas Jefferson, that all of the cabins would have had a garden associated with them. Here, with the garden very close to the cabin, but the garden may have been some distance away from the cabin. They would have mainly tried to grow crops that were quite high in energy. There would have been quite a lot of potatoes grown and a lot of sweet corn grown, but then they would also grown some crops where would have made their meals more interesting. For example, we also have some strawberries growing there. We have some onions and cabbage and spinach. Some plantations, the enslaved people wouldn't have had a garden and they just got rations from the plantation owner. Having a garden meant that they had a bit more fresh food and maybe slightly better food. But you have to remember that the enslaved people worked from dawn to dusk, from sunrise to sunset, and it meant that the only time that they had to tend their garden was at dusk, or oftentimes they would have had maybe a Sunday afternoon off. It also was an opportunity for them to do something on their own, where they weren't controlled by the plantation owner. Tobacco is really essential to the telling of the story of slavery in North America. It was grown of tobacco in the early 1600s around the Jamestown settlement that led to the first importation of black Africans to work for the owners of the farmland. Rogan in his early days would probably have been growing mainly maybe cotton on his plantation, but the cotton plantations moved further south and tobacco became the main crop on the Rogan plantation. It's unfortunate that we don't know the names of many of the people enslaved by the Rogan family. Over the period from 1790 to 1863, there could have been hundreds of people who were enslaved by this family. The fact that there were 70 people in the 1860 census would only be part of the story. We do have baptismal records because the Rogan family ensured that all their enslaved children were baptised. We're still working our way through them, but some of the names we've found were Mariam, Isabella, William and Cornelium. After the end of the American Civil War and black Americans were freed in the South, we do know that a small number stayed on at the house. Their names being Stokely, Jason, Richmond, Eliza Bill and Rhodes. We don't really see black Americans starting to regain any sense of their rights until the 1960s, where you see a flowering of the civil rights movement, and it's only then that black Americans start to make progress towards getting their full rights as citizens. The civil rights movement has seen a resurgence in this decade, particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement, which has highlighted a number of issues that people face based on race.